Compass and Clock. I'm your host, Mary Copeland. This infotainment podcast explores how to live your best life now and well into retirement. We'll talk topics in financial planning, housing, and insurance. We'll talk wellness, relationships, and leisure activities. A full, active life requires planning for your goals and preparing for the unexpected. I'll introduce you to a variety of guests, from knowledgeable experts to folks sharing stories of their life experiences and so much more. Because life is big. All is intended to help guide you in planning for what you need now and at any age. Like and subscribe so you don't miss a thing. Today, my guest is Bob Tice. Bob graduated from Hartwick College in New York with a degree in chemistry, and he worked in the pharmaceutical industry until he retired at the young age of 55. Bob and Susan have two daughters, and when one of them started doing track and field in high school, Bob volunteered to be an official, and up until 2019, he's been officiating track and field competitions of all kinds: high school, college, state, national, and even the Olympics. Today, Bob and I are going to talk about his story and how he planned for retirement, plus his years of involvement with track and field. Bob, welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
Bob, you're a longtime friend of my mom and dad, so thank you so much for sharing your life story with me. So I'm just going to jump in and ask you to start at college graduation and your first job. You had graduated with a degree in chemistry, and you worked in a lab as a chemist in the field of quality control. So briefly walk us through your career.
Well, it took me 5.5 years to get through college because I had a problem with academics and social life. Saying that, when I did graduate, finally, I sent out applications to 18 companies. And the first one that came back, my dad said to me, he says, probably the only offer you're going to get, so you better take it. So I took it, and it was with Norwich Pharmaceutical. That is mid-state New York, between Binghamton and Syracuse. Started out as a chemist, and $2 an hour wasn't very much, but it was a job. I then got an offer 3 months later to work as a chemist at Liability Labs, which is a division of American Scientific, and worked there for 4.5 years before I moved on to the next job. At that place, however, I met my wife. She was a tour guide in public relations. And then the next job was with Geigy, before they merged with Geigy. And it was a lab supervisor, quality control all along. And at that location, and with some people that said, geez, you may have some management talent. And that management talent needs to be refined. You need to go to culture school. So I went to culture school, several of them. One of them was at LSU, and others have been at UConn and Harvard. And as a result, I finally ended up being assistant director of quality control for Geigy. Geigy is a pharmaceutical firm. The first location in the United States was the place where I went to work. And Swiss people are very conservative, and I was just lucky to have a job and didn't have to move. So that's it as far as my opportunities with a career. We decided, or I decided at 30, boy, this work thing is great, but I've worked since I was a kid, lived on a farm. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go to college because New York State Thruway came through our farm and provided some money for my parents to send me to college. So
Bob, with your career and raising your family, does that mean that this took place in the state of New York?
Yes, that's in the lower state of New York, just south of West Point. We had those two girls, and One of them end up going to track. The location is actually west of the Tappan Zee Bridge, for those people that know that area or have familiar with that name.
So let me ask you about the track and field and how this got started. So one of your daughters took up track and field at your local high school, and you volunteered to be an official at the track and field meets. So tell me a little bit about what draws you to this, that you stuck with it for several decades.
Well, as you might know, or people might know, the track meet is a 10-ring circus. And every one of the events in track and field requires somebody to run it.
Okay.
And so, geez, I said, as a parent, I'm coming to all these meets. Why don't I contribute something rather than just observe her events? She was a sprinter, so there were a lot of other events going on at the same time. High jump, pole vault, shot put. Outdoor, there was javelin and a heavyweight throw. There's plenty of events, and all of them need somebody to run. So that was my beginning. And when I thought about retiring, I decided that I wanted to continue doing this. So I looked at, well, we can go into what I did, but essentially, we didn't have computers in those days. And so when I was looking for a place to retire, I fortunately had the opportunity to travel part of the United States as a result of my job. And so we looked at every place that I went to for what the cost of living was a big thing. Having money to be able to survive, housing, my throat is going dry.
Okay, then I'll talk for a second. I'm going to jump in here because you and I have had a conversation previously. So go ahead, grab some water. But you had shared with me a little bit
Give me some water.
About how you plan. You had shared with me a little bit about how you plan for retirement, starting at the age of 30. You know, I believe you said at 30, you said, I want to retire when I'm 50. And you started putting money away. And you had told me a story about a seminar that was offered at your job that spoke about retirement and helping people figure it out. So can you share with our listeners a little bit about that?
Well, Geigy had an investment saving program, which allowed employees to put away 5%, and they matched 5%. But then they also had something that allowed me to put another 5% in the following year. So that meant 15% of money was going into my investment savings program. There were 3 options in that program: very aggressive, very weak, and something that you wouldn't lose your money in. And so I went, being conservative, into 20% of my salary into a fund that was rather conservative, but still made some money. And that, if you can put away 20% of your salary in total, that it was a good start.
At the age of 30. So at
the age of 30, well,
20%.
No, that started at 30. You know, I had to wait a year before they could increase it to 5%. To 10, and then another 5% to 20. Excuse me.
And then the company had a seminar that talked about retirement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, very fortunate that the company saw fit to prepare people for retirement or offer them the opportunity to get prepared. And they had this program where you brought your wife in or your spouse and talked about many things. And many things include how much money do you need to retire, where you want to retire, the type of house you want to have, the type of weather you want to be associated with, dental care, health care, airport transportation. Do you have to take care of your parents as they get older? tax rates. We knew we could not afford to live in New York State in retirement at that early age. And of course, what do you do with your spare time now that you're not working? And we also have to consider if you're a grandparent that you're babysitting and all of a sudden that babysitter is not going to be there, or your kid's going to be able to handle that. So planning was a big thing. I went to the libraries, as I indicated before, and did a lot of research. And each one of these trips was enabled me to look at those areas. We looked at California, Arizona, Mississippi, Florida, and finally, North Carolina.
And from the seminar that you attended at work, you know, all those topics that they went over with you were great questions to think about. And I believe you settled in North Carolina because there was a handful of criteria you were looking for. So you want to list those off? I know it had to do with weather and golf courses, a single family home.
Well, we didn't play golf before we got here, but we planned on playing golf. The weather was a big factor, an opportunity to officiate, fishing, hunting, all those things stood out above the other states. Florida was just much too crowded for us to even consider. California, again, very expensive. So we looked at what we had. We wanted to live on a lake. And so we looked at 60 homes in 2 weeks, a week in January and a week in June. So we looked at 60 homes in the area to make our decision.
And this was all in person because, again, this was not when there were computers and you can easily go on and do a Google search.
No, sometimes you saw a little box in the newspaper that showed a house and what the price was. So price was a prime concern, of course. And of course, we ran into a situation where we didn't sell a house in New York before we moved here. So we carried that mortgage for another 8 months.
So you landed in North Carolina, and you're still officiating at this point. So one of the criteria you were looking for was not only a single-story home on the lake to thrive in place. You were also looking at the weather, golf courses, but you were looking to be close to a university that had track and field that gave you the opportunity to officiate. Is that correct?
That's correct. I went to the high school, local high school to begin with, and said, the coach said, I'd be glad to have you. And I wanted to do something a little bit higher than high school. And so I contacted the University of North Carolina. And that was an opening door it was winter track indoor. They had an indoor facility. Not everybody has an indoor facility. They had a great program, and the coach put me to work the first time, and he said to me after it was over, he said, what'd you think? And I said, well, I know I can make some improvements here. So he says, well, I'll see you next week. So I went back. And of course, if you go to college meets, you also meet coaches from other colleges that saw me work, and evidently I would impress some people. So I got invites to go all over the place.
Right, you traveled and you were officiating in college and university meets, but this also led to state competitions, national, and you have an Olympic story, I believe. Do you want to tell us about that?
Well, before we get there, let's start with some world championships that I've been involved with. World championships in Maine, Sacramento, and the big one in Australia. So I've been around. I've done NCAA Division 1, 2, and 3, national championships. And along the way, you develop a talent that people are evaluating you at all the time. And so I got invited to do the Olympics. High jump specifically. I'm 6'9", and so they figured they didn't need a step ladder. And so I could put the bar back up without that. Greatest experience other than getting married and having kids in my life. And it still remains that way. I measured the Olympic record 25 years ago, June of this year, the Olympic record for the high jump at 2.39 meters, which is, for those that you are mathematically inclined to think in feet and inches, it's 7'10". Pretty high, but I measured it. And of course, we had a tape there, and I went like this, and there I was on TV from just exactly what you see of me here, holding a tape in front of me. That record still stands today, and I still keep in touch with the guy that set the record, Charles Austin in Texas.
That's awesome. That's a great story.
That was a great experience, but again, track and field didn't pay very much, if anything.
You were a volunteer for many, many, many years.
Yeah, I told my wife I was spending her retirement money. Although she didn't have it, I was the only one that had the retirement money. And by the way, at the time I retired, you could take monthly checks, or you could take all your money in the investment savings program and all the money had been put aside for retirement. I decided not to take monthly checks. I thought that I could manage my money better than what they were managing it. I had a daughter, our daughter, the one that ran track, worked in the financial industry and gave me some hints where to put my money. And of course, most of it is mutual funds, but if you leave it there, it makes a little money, sufficient enough to retire and enjoy traveling around.
Now, when you and I were talking about track and field, because you have been in it many, many decades, you just stopped a couple of years ago, but you were volunteering and you were traveling for that, and that expense was coming out of your pocket. And I believe you were the person that was behind two initiatives, so to speak, and you saw them through to fruition that helped other officiates and yourself at that point, and the programs are still doing that. So can you talk to us a little bit about that, what you started?
Okay, most of the track and field officials across the country, like you said, they pay their own expenses. You've either got to be independently wealthy or have connections in the travel industry. I recognize that all these officials are in similar boat that I am. They can travel, but they can only travel so far before the expenses get too much. I decided, since I had the opportunity to travel more so than others, that maybe if we organized ourselves to some degree, we could get to the point where they'd get some compensation. So I encouraged all over the country, people, even at our national conventions, we got to do something about this. All the other sports pay, and officials, you know, some of those are major rewards for the services for a few hours. Track meet is usually 2 or 3 days, and we work from 8 to 10 hours a day. So finally, I was able to convince enough people to go back to their universities or back to their places where the money is budgeted and say, you've got to put something aside. So I did surveys of all the conferences, majority of the conferences in the United States, as to what they were paying at the championship level, not what they were paying at the collegiate level. And some were embarrassing low. Some of them gave meals if the meal time happened to be at the time the track was being used for competition. Of course, that was, if you didn't travel, you know, other than by car, or if you did travel by airplane, it was expensive. So finally, we made it a dent. I did national presentations, PowerPoint presentations at our annual meetings, and trying to get people to recognize we got to do something. You got to do something. You're a fool if you continue to provide this service at nothing when your colleagues in other sports are getting something. So that's the beginning of it. It eventually, conferences recognized it, colleges recognized it. It started at the college level where most of them started to put money aside. You know, even if it was $50, even if it was $100 for 2 days work, that's a lot of money compared to zilch.
So that covered your travel and room and board, I believe. It was put towards
Well, it started out with room and board.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us that are travel by air, yes, if you got enough money. Track and field has a whole bunch of tiers or levels of responsibility. And so the higher you are in that ladder, the more compensation you get. I was fortunate enough to have the years of service and some sort of a reputation that, put me in a category that not everybody was in. So I was very fortunate.
There was another initiative that you also spawned, and it had to do with liability insurance for the officiates.
Okay, you're right. Track and field has many different events which are dangerous. The javelin is a primary one. Jumping over a pole or a bar that's 16, 17, 18 feet in the air. High jump, not so high, but still needs a pad, and that positioning of the pad and the location, all that sort of stuff. Shot put, you're talking about the athletes and the officials' safety, but we're primarily concerned about spectators. Spectators are there, and sometimes they get in the way, and sometimes they get hurt. Sometimes officials get hurt if they don't pay attention to what's going on. And so lawyers became very, very popular. And that popularity forced me to say, oh boy, we need to have something that covers these officials when they're performing this duty. So national organization recognized it. They put me in charge of a committee, and the biggest job to come up with is who's going to pay for that coverage and what companies are willing to provide that type of variety of liability insurance. So a few years later, everything come to fruition. We found a company, and we were able to convince the officials that included in their registration fee would be the cost of insurance. Believe it or not, it was only $3 a person at that time. We had up to 9,000 officials across the country. So I kept pushing and saying we need to get insurance covered by our national organization, the United States Track and Field. And finally, we were able to convince them they should pick up that coverage.
Yep.
Because we were performing a service that next to nothing.
So today they're paying the premiums for the officiates.
Yes. Now they pay the premiums, and the premiums cover $2 million per official.
So way back when your daughter was in high school and you decided to volunteer, decades later, you retired from being an officiate in 2019, and you were responsible for putting insurance liability in place and for getting compensated for volunteering. And I believe you were, what would it be, voted into a Hall of Fame or something?
Yeah, our organization, the United States Track and Field, has a Hall of Fame. The officials have their own Hall of Fame, and I was fortunate enough to be selected to that Hall of Fame. Another great experience in my life. Got a nice, not a trophy, they gave you a memento of the occasion. It's a high degree of recognition by your peers. There's a lot of competition that goes into it. And of course, recommendations from all over. So I've been very fortunate in my career to be able to have received that.
So, Bob, we usually keep our podcast to 20 or 25 minutes. So I know we've done the condensed version of your retirement story, but what would you like to share with the listeners as it pertains to preparing for retirement, planning for it in advance, and how it has served you well, all these years later? What would you like to say?
Well, you've got to start planning early. You can't wait to that retirement seminar and have the couples being asked the question, what kind of house do you want to live in? And the husband, you do it independently. The husband writes what he thinks he wants. The wife, you need to communicate before a retirement seminar to find out what your likes and dislikes are. There are tons and tons of information, well, now on the web, of the things to look at. I listed some at the beginning. They are endless, but planning is key. You've got to be serious about it. Just say, I'm going to retire at 65. Well, retiring at 65, remember, you're not young anymore. What are you going to do? So you have to plan a future. Like I said, where you're going to live, how much you need to live. And of course, looking at families today, a place that you can get to airport-wise to be able to travel to see your family, or likewise for them to see you.
And definitely finding a community where it has activities that you enjoy doing, so that, being active really prolongs your life and staying social, and it helps with your health and movement, etc.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Planning what you want to do. And I look at financials all the time as far as our own situation. You never know how long you're going to live. You look at your parents and say, geez, my parents lived till 91, so maybe I'll make it. But you got to have enough money and be comfortable. I look also at what senior living opportunities live, where you want to go as a senior, not only while you're retired and active, but do you want senior living? Is that for you? Or you want assisted living? And of course, your kid's going to want you to have this, and you're not necessarily in agreement. A lot of planning is necessary.
You're correct in that. And what you don't want is you don't want to outlive your money. You want your money to outlive you.
Absolutely. That's key. Well, you can't start a job at 85, 90 years old and start making the money that you used to make.
Yeah, there might be some other candidates that are more valuable than you are at that point. But what I would say is you're truly an inspiration, Bob, and I do appreciate you spending time with me today, so our listeners can benefit from your wisdom. So,
well, I thank you for having me, and of course, I'm like to be considered for future opportunities to share a little bit more detail on specific topics.
Okay, we'll talk about that when we get off this podcast. But for today, Bob, thank you so much. And thank you, listeners. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.